My name's Julie Ward and I'm a North West Labour MEP, so I represent the huge region that covers the 5 counties in the North West, so Cheshire, Lancashire, Cumbria, Greater Manchester and Merseyside. And I feel very much that I represent young people, although I'm not young. Within the Culture and Education Committee, which is my main committee, we do youth policy. So I always want to speak up for young people.
So what does Theresa May's Chequers plan mean to you, and do you think it's workable?
Well, I'm very worried about the plan because it's still focused very much on things, on objects, on trade itself, and doesn't, for me, really address the fundamental issue about what the European Union is, which is it's a union of social values. And so when she wanted to just have this trade of goods, the idea that other things cannot move, so people cannot move. And as somebody who worked in the arts and culture sector before I was in politics, there's a massive issue about freedom of movement for me in terms of artists, in terms of young people in education, in terms of the sharing of ideas. So for me, it's a no-go.
In your opinion, can Article 50 be revoked?
Well, it might even be illegal, actually. Article 50 itself might even be illegal because there was no... it was supposed to be an advisory referendum in the first place, and so I'm really interested in all the legal challenges that are happening throughout this whole process, because the experts are looking at the detail of everything from the treaties to the different legislative acts that have been brought in Westminster to try and make the process happen. And there's so many flaws, there's so many loopholes, there's so many things that are actually undemocratic. And so for me, we have to keep talking about that. We have to talk about how the process itself was a very poor democratic process, and how our democracy was in fact hijacked by the Russians, by interference, by Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. And at the end of the day, it was an advisory referendum. And for me, I think it's very important to talk about how undemocratic the process was. There's also issues about the possibility of Article 50 being extended, so there's a whole load of wiggle room, actually. And what Theresa May has failed to do is to give herself any wiggle room. Okay, she needs to go.
Crazy. Isn't this whole business of Brexit just a strategy or a preamble to selling Britain off to American conglomerates? We've heard about possibly the NHS being privatised. We've also heard about food safety and environmental standards being dropped so that we can import American or Australian beef. Is this a worry for you?
It's a huge worry, yeah. You have to think about who's driving Brexit, okay? Brexit is a UKIP agenda, right? UKIP are now in the Conservative Party, big time. The majority of the British political parties are pro-European, and we are now enacting a UKIP agenda. And I think everybody should be worried about this, okay? This is about no regulation. It's about talking about... here in this Parliament, what we are concerned with is fair rules by which society can make things better for everybody. And those fair rules mean that we have to talk about health and safety, we have to talk about people's rights, and what Brexit is doing is stripping away all of those things. So I'm very concerned. I think I'm massively concerned about the NHS. We see so many attacks to the NHS, and we have to understand that the Brexiteers are lining things up for themselves already. They're putting their money into all sorts of dodgy organisations in other countries. They've got, if you look at their interests, they've got interests in all kinds of companies that make bids to take over public utilities. So I think we need to be really, really worried about the whole nature of what Brexit is and who is driving it forwards. And it's not in the interests of the 99%, that's for certain.
The Good Friday Agreement is a peace treaty that's registered with the UN. Breaking that may result in UN sanctions. The Good Friday Agreement is not just law, it's a legally binding international agreement. Would Brexit mean by default the UK is breaking an international treaty? And if so, what are the implications?
I've been to Northern Ireland. I went before I was elected, so I got a sense of a community rebuilding itself, how important it was for the different sides to come together in dialogue, how important it was for them to agree. I was there, in fact, as an artist, as a cultural activist, to see how the use of arts was important in peace-building processes. But I also went again in April and talked to communities actually living on the border. And for many people, Brexit itself is against the Good Friday Agreement. So people there feel that, peace is fragile. And you can see that for yourself. You can see how important it is to have these international agreements absolutely respected by everybody, and how when that is talked down, when there are any kind of threats to that, and Brexit is a huge threat for peace in Northern Ireland, when there's any kind of threat, you can see how people begin to feel very vulnerable, how people begin to feel frightened again, how those forces, how people begin to form up into divisions again against each other. And that had all gone because of what the EU did in playing its part to make the peace process. I'm very worried that, we are going to see some of the same kind of tribalism that we saw already. And I can tell you that children who have been born since the Good Friday Agreement and young people who are growing up in Northern Ireland now, they don't deserve to live through the horrors that their parents and their grandparents lived through. It's really, really important that politicians understand how dangerous it is to start talking in terms that address the Good Friday Agreement as if it isn't important. And I have to say there have been politicians on several sides, people who have spoken as if the Good Friday Agreement has run its course, or it's not fit for purpose anymore, or we don't need it anymore. And I think those people who have said those things, and it does include people in the Labour Party, I have to say Barry Gardner's words were absolutely atrocious. And I don't want to hear any of that kind of discussion again from anybody. If you go to Northern Ireland and you meet with people in Northern Ireland and you hear what their fears are for any politician to in any way whatsoever undermine the Good Friday Agreement is absolutely it's an appalling state of affairs we've got to. So and one final word on this, okay? The DUP. Being, if you like, the power brokers at the minute in Westminster is perhaps for me the most worrying thing that has happened in the past 18 months. That Theresa May should be doing a deal with a party that is anti-abortion, it's anti-EU, climate change deniers, creationist. What are we talking about here? This is a small group of people with a particularly extreme view of the world who are now holding sway across the whole of the United Kingdom and have power. And that should really, really worry all of us who care about democracy.
Julie, what does Brexit mean to you?
Well, on a personal level, I only came into politics to stand against austerity. After the Labour Party lost the general election in 2010 and the coalition government brought in austerity measures, I could see that everything I cared about was going to be cut. So I was working in the arts, so the arts are going to be cut, libraries have been cut, youth service has been cut, career service has been cut, healthcare has been cut, social care provision for people with disabilities is being cut. Lots of community centres, village halls, losing their funding. That's the result of austerity. And all I can see ahead of us, if we Brexit, is more austerity. And I don't see how we can have the kind of society that we really need in the UK and across Europe, frankly, if we continue to impose more austerity. And I think that the economic outlook for people, for ordinary people, and in fact for the poorest communities and the most vulnerable communities in the UK, the outlook for them post-Brexit is very, very bleak. It will just mean more and more austerity. Well, I'm an anti-austerity politician, and if you are an anti-austerity activist, I think you have to stand against Brexit.
I read in The Economist a few weeks ago about how Portugal has sort of broken the EU mould and have gone against austerity, and there have been some quite good results there. Is that something that the UK could look at, potentially emulate?
We have some. I'm a socialist, and I work here in the group with the socialists and Democrats, and it's really fantastic to see what some of our socialist governments are doing. Sweden is another example. Spain has just gotten itself a new socialist government. You know, if you care about refugees, if you care about welcoming people, if you care about the poorest people in society, then you have to look at what some of the socialist, the new breed of socialist governments that are coming into power across the EU are doing. So Portugal is a great example. If I just talk for a minute about Spain, you know, many people in the UK really despair and are very upset when they see the situation for the refugees in the Mediterranean. So what happens in Italy? They get in neo-fascist governments, you know, who turn their backs on refugees, who can't show any kind of compassion at all. And then you get, within days of the new Spanish government being in power, they open the ports and welcome the ships of refugees. And that's what I want to see. I want to see, you know, compassion back in politics again. I want to see us being able to be inclusive of all kinds of people. We have a duty to look after everybody and to understand that the riches and the benefits that we have here in Europe, we have to see how we can work better with other countries and with the poorest people in society and with people who are fleeing because of conflict, who are fleeing because of unsustainable lives. We have a responsibility. You know, our colonial past doesn't let us off the hook.